Hi, everybody. It's a privilege to introduce our speaker for this session, Dr. Jim Harries. He is a scholar and missionary whose life's work exists at the vital intersection of language, culture, and global theology. He has published widely on these topics. Jim holds a PhD from the University of Birmingham. His trajectory was profoundly shaped during his initial missionary term in Zambia from 88 to 91, where he recognized a critical gap in understanding between Western missionaries and local nationals. Driven to build truer bridges, he moved to East Africa in 1993 and has worked in Kenya and Tanzania ever since. By providing theological education in indigenous languages and partnering with African independent churches, he has dived deeply into the relationship between language and the people's way of life. He currently serves as adjunct faculty at William Carey International University. Jim brings these decades of ground-level insight into dialogue with our newest digital frontier in his presentation. He will challenge us to look beyond the popular narrative of artificial intelligence, arguing that while AI is viewed as globally disruptive, its current models remain narrowly Western. Dr. Harries posits that when Bible translators privilege traditional Western interpretations, they risk marginalizing indigenous orthodoxies. By reading scripture through the eyes of local audiences, translators can bridge global theological gaps and offer a vital corrective to Western-centric AI systems. Jim, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hansi, for that introduction. I think you've said it all. I can shut up now. There's no more to say. Anyway, there's very grateful for that brief introduction, and sorry to disrupt the conversations that I was overhearing that were going on in a very lively style. Yesterday I used German. German's not my strongest language, so allow me today to use English. And I also fill in a little bit of the introduction that it was there given by Hansi. One, to say very grateful for Mark Smith's presentation yesterday. I think he and I run in some parallel tracks and have some insights in common. And as I indicated yesterday, we communicate a great deal under the umbrella of the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission. I also noted yesterday, I didn't see a face, but there was someone speaking English, I think with an English accent, talked about living 4 years in Ghana, which seemed to be what SIL and Bible translators would want, that in order to translate the Bible correctly, you need to be close to the people, learn their language, live with them, associate with them, and so forth. I mean, two things to add there. In a sense, I think it would be not entirely correct to hold Bible translation organizations responsible, because the issue is much wider. But also to say that perhaps in a similar way, according to what I heard yesterday, I was struck by what I found in Zambia in the late 80s and early 90s. And I just had to think to myself, someone has to do something about this and try to find out what's going on. Why is there this massive cultural gap between Western missionaries and African people, and yet it must be ignored in order to thrive in the contemporary world, perhaps we can say dominated by secular liberalism, if we want to look at it that way. So, yes, I was in Zambia then, and perhaps one thing that happened, which is unusual, usually a new missionary is put to live with another missionary. I was put to stay with Zambians, and because there was no one else available, I was at the school, the important place was the hospital. And that was striking from the beginning to land in a house with a Zambian. His nephew would cook and we would eat together. And I was at a secondary school with Zambian colleagues of roughly my age. And I remember many things, but one being one time walking with my housemate who walked incredibly slowly. And it became apparent that what I had to say obviously arose from some kind of superiority. I mean, I was a model that they were supposed to follow. Now, that's fair enough in a way, but what I realized is that the model works when the model has money. And then raises the question, is what we're doing entirely with money? And increasingly, a gap of discourse, language, the way people talked about things and thought about things. My Zambian colleagues were in a different world to my American colleagues. Many of my colleagues there were Americans. I'm British, for those who haven't gathered that yet. But neither side seemed to acknowledge it. I mean, the Zambians didn't say, but I appreciate that we don't understand you. No, they thought they were understanding very well and that the Americans were getting things wrong. And similarly, the Americans assumed that the Zambians were understanding them and that the Zambians were obviously getting things wrong. They needed perhaps more education. So there's a massive no man's land between these two, which exploration of which is somewhat taboo. And so, again, I don't think it's only Bible translation organizations struggling with it. Now, what the Lord showed to me in, say, 1990, 91 and going forward, that there is a way that a Western missionary can function where they negate a large part of the dominance, which is by using entirely local languages in key ministry and not investing outside resources in what you're doing. If you use entirely local languages, you really can't, well, you can't easily say things that local people aren't saying anyway. Or if you do, you're not understood. But frankly, the categories of the local language tend to hold you back because you presume a certain term is a translation of an English term, which of course in absolute terms it isn't. So use of the local tongue holds you back. And of course, if you use it, you learn it, you hear it, and you hear what the local people are doing. And then secondly, not investing outside resources in your key ministry. I don't mean that missionaries don't need support. Because, I mean, you go to another country, you don't have family, you're not allowed to work in the cases I'm aware of. If you're on a missionary visa, you need support, and you may need support at a relatively high level because your body's spoiled by high quality foods, perhaps, things like that. But in terms of ministry, to avoid those investing resources in what you're doing, so you don't buy privilege on account of your background. And I think there's overlap there, as I say, with Mark's presentation yesterday. So the presentation I have today is entitled Bible Translations, Wider Responsibility, with respect to theological bifurcation in the world of artificial generative intelligence. Now, this conference was promoted as being a place in which we should have a certain focus on artificial intelligence. And I did a lot of this research in 2025. I don't know whether things have changed much, but certainly then, and I guess now, there's two opinions on what AI is bringing. There's one set of people who say it's a kind of utopia. Once AI starts to take its own initiative, it will organize everything for us. All you'll have to do in your life is like suck water out of one tube, eat out of another tube, watch TV, and life will be just fun. You know, everyone will be so happy because everything will be provided. And I guess in due course we'll live forever in this kind of sorry state. Now I think that's a bit exaggerated, but the other side talks about annihilation. There could be billions of people dying as a result of artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not exactly going to say one side's wrong or the other's correct. I guess there's somewhere in the middle. But the latter does concern me because AI only knows about contemporary human ignorance. AI doesn't even know the things that we know and we don't talk about. It only knows the things that we talk about or write about. And there are lots of things in life that one doesn't talk or write about. And there are hefty taboos that are required to undergird contemporary ideologies such as secular liberalism. So what happens if AI innovates? Well, at the moment, if AI innovates, then it will make the same wrong assumptions as the rest of us, that everyone in the world basically thinks like an American. A white, weird American, middle class and all that, which was the assumption I came to Africa with. Essentially, there's very little means of getting beyond that assumption in the West. I think because, well, that's just what the West believes. It's a contemporary ideology. And if you go contrary to it, then in Western terms, you become hated even. People don't like it because you're undermining their comfortable way in which they're seeing the way forward. I don't say comfortable in a derogatory way, but the visions of planning is all based on the essential assumption that, let's say, the Christian history that our forefathers experienced, perhaps from year 0 to 1800, is of no import. Because, of course, what these people want to do is discredit the impact that Christianity has had on our forefathers and thus has had and is having on us. So then I would suggest AI cannot deal with. It is ignorant of, as ignorant as many of us are, of different ways of thinking around the world. So let's go on to think, I'll come back to that in some ways later, but comprehension gap. And I'd like to, of course, make any case, simplify a little to say that those believers or those Bible readers in Africa have two sources of information. One is what I could call traditional theologies. When I say traditional, I include here the Catholic Church, I include here Protestant churches, the Orthodox Church to a large extent, Pentecostal churches to some extent. They're exposed to this. And it includes things like ecumenical councils, centuries of history. And of course it includes prominent theologians like Augustine, Aquinas, and more obscure theologians, but nevertheless who have a major impact. Helen White comes to mind, of the Seventh-day Adventists. Of course, the actors we know about who were around in the time of the Reformation. And there's a push for, my focus is on Africa, but I think this applies more widely, African and majority world churches to appropriate all this. Now, this is the requirement to appropriate a history that they've not experienced. Now, again, very often they seem to appropriate it because to deny having appropriated it is to cut yourself off from funding and a lot of very beneficial, in material terms, relationships with the West. And perhaps it's to cut yourself off from a lot of beneficial theology. I don't deny that. That isn't the topic of my talk, whether what's happened in the last 2,000 years is beneficial or whether we'd be better off not having had the church councils and Augustine and so forth. I assume that we're better off having those, having heard, through those histories, having learned from them. But pointing out that our majority world cousins have not been exposed to that. Now, as Bible translators, I'm aware a lot of translators work in Africa, presuming Indonesia. In other words, the front line of Bible translation tends to be, I think I'm right in saying, amongst people who've not shared the history of the West. So, hence the relevance to Bible translation. And I can add that in my endeavors at coming to terms with what's happening in Africa, I've done a great deal of research and work on language and translation myself. I'm surely not of as high a standard as Bible translators, but in some ways I think, unfortunately, what Bible translation does, it kind of usurps linguistic Christians into a task and thus denies the wider mission body of the kind of expertise from which they would also benefit. So language knowledge, appreciation, linguistics is vital for regular mission as well as for Bible translation. So, where am I here now? Okay, so Bible translation then, or Bible translators. And now I'm basically here talking about Western Bible translators. Because Western Bible translators are those who are born and raised in traditional theologies and then come to be exposed to non-traditional theologies, which I call indigenous theologies. Traditional theologies I call Orthodoxy 1, and those theologies that arise when people read their Bibles without all that history, I can also call Orthodoxy 2. So Western people whose societies are operating the basis of Orthodoxy 1, who acquire an understanding of Orthodoxy 2, I think must be Bible translators, because who spends more effort in intricately analysing, let's say, indigenous people's responses to the scriptures than our Bible translation colleagues? Now, as my title indicates, I'm suggesting that that gives us a responsibility over and beyond Bible translation. One of my foci in my own work is working with indigenous African churches. I'm currently in Tanzania, but my main base in Kenya. In a typical week, I can easily visit 4 different indigenous churches. In other words, African churches that are led by and often founded by African people who are not looking for foreign money and so don't bother trying to align themselves with traditional theologies, Orthodoxy 1. This gives me a great deal of experience in a certain flavour of Orthodoxy 2. In other words, Orthodoxy 2, I think, has a certain reality to it. There are patterns in Orthodoxy 2, and its flavour is very different from that of Orthodoxy 1. So, Bible translators, I assume, recognise the bifurcation I'm referring to. Now, like everybody else, they may be slow to report on it or to talk about it because it really doesn't get you street cred in the West. But what I'm saying is that there's an important need to break the taboos and to begin to take majority world reality into account. Now, my particular focus on doing this is so as to feed large language models, which AI thrives off. So that I'm suggesting that it should bear on our conscience as Bible translators that there is a critical role for us to play because other people are fearful of playing it, of revealing the truth of our multicultural world to the internet and what it incorporates. Again, this is a role that surely our majority world colleagues can also play, but those who realize what's happening in the West are those born and raised in the West. So again, my focus is on people, who've lived in the West for a period, but very much on those who grasp it deeply in order to realize what is different. And I think this making people aware of this could be a difference between AI resulting in the death of billions, or AI at least making a decent help, being a decent help to everybody. Now, what's happening at the moment as some kind of justification, well, let's ignore orthodoxy too. And let's hope that it will go away. It often seems to me like here in Africa, we are on hold. People are expected to imitate the West consistently, and any independent thinking is basically condemned. Now, I mean, that may sound striking, but if you think simply of the educational system that's operating around Africa, predominantly European languages, the best education is that in UK or in the USA. So the closest African people follow that following model, the better their education is. What spoils a model is when they think for themselves. So there's an enormous amount of resistance to acknowledging that when African people think for themselves, they think about things differently than we do. Now, what I'm suggesting is that we need to acknowledge the presence of orthodoxy too, of indigenous theology, in order to address it. Now, I'm speaking as a missionary, as a theological educator, as a Bible translator. Now, I appreciate that Bible translators have this aversion to theology. At least that's how I see it. And I really grasped this more recently, and I think I'm understanding that, and it falls into the paradigm I'm presenting. It's because theologians, i.e. Western theologians, promote orthodoxy 1, and thus conceal orthodoxy 2. And the Bible translators who are more aware of orthodoxy 2 would rather people build on what's indigenous, because actually you have to build on what's indigenous. So acknowledging orthodoxy 2 would be an enabling of paying attention to orthodoxy 2. And there are a number of options then. You could either say, well, we have two orthodoxies and they will go on for perpetuity as different orthodoxies, or we can say orthodoxy 2 is wrong and condemn it, they're not Christians, or we can say orthodoxy 2 ought to be more like orthodoxy 1. Now, I think as what can I say, contemporary Western Christians, we must hold the latter position. To deny our superiority is to fool others, in other words. Not that we are proud of any superiority we might have. I believe that superiority can be traced to God. He's the one who deserves the glory, not us. But just the direction of flow of immigration says that the Christian countries have learned something. So again, a denial of orthodoxy 2 or indigenous theology is actually, it seems to me, selfish, because it's pretending that we've got nothing to teach others. We do have things to teach others, and as Westerners we must acknowledge that, I believe. Now, as Africans also, everyone should have something to teach to the foreigner. Now, if you trace that carefully, you often realize it's different language, different categories that use in different languages make the other person seem ignorant, but nevertheless, we have something to share. We need to make an effort to share it and not just say, up to them, if they're going to get lost, they're going to get lost. Can't help them, which seems to be the attitude today, illustrated by the tendency, if one wants to hear about Africa, one has a black face and not a white face. And these days the thinking is that we need to learn about indigenous people from indigenous people. Now, unfortunately, that's very faulted, because the very indigenous people are living on a thread which is the umbilical cord connecting our money to them. Plus, of course, we can't understand them because they're not building on our foundation. In order to understand somebody, they have to be building essentially on the same foundation as you have had. So this is a responsibility I take as being the Westerners, and those who are well informed are indeed Bible translators. Now, some examples to illustrate the gap. One is Trinity. Indigenous churches I'm familiar with, self-led churches and so on in Africa. In Kenya, in almost all cases, will acknowledge the Trinity. We believe in God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, when it comes to articulating the Trinity, now you have a difficulty, because whereas in English we have this convenient two terms, you can be a person and you can be a people. Yeah, so there can be three people, it's different from three persons. So the Trinity has three persons, which are not three people. That's clear to us when we're brought up using English, and I think other European languages the same. Well, that's not there in African languages. So if you say there are three people, then people say, no, they're not. They're not three human beings. They're not human beings at all. So you can't, using African languages, articulate the Trinity. What we do in Swahili, we say three souls in one body, or something like that, which kind of gets it close, but isn't sufficiently close to actually innovate the Trinity, or to comprehend the Trinity biblically, which requires linguistic innovation. Another example, monogamy is another classic. We can argue from the Bible that monogamy is God's best plan. You can also argue from the Bible that polygamy is a close second. Polygamy is also very preferred, and you could probably argue quite coherently that polygamy is absolutely acceptable. Now that runs strongly in the face of Western Christianity, Western ways of life, which indicates again how our secular liberal ways of life we practice today are rooted in an interpretation of scriptures, but an interpretation that is historically dependent. I mean, it's not universal. It takes more than just the Bible in your African language to understand that. It takes a drawing on history and tradition, which is a point that we're making here, that we have many believers in the world these days who don't share that history and tradition. What are we going to do about it? Healing is biomedical. Now, the term healing in English essentially usually refers to bacteria, correction in bodily processes or psychological processes, whereas healing in African languages means something very different. It tends to mean perhaps something like a way of dealing with your emotions. So it seems not to be possible for people from within their African worldview to grasp the possibility that healing is biomedical. Another example, the possibility of discussing the doctrine of transubstantiation. So I'm not saying the doctrine is right or the doctrine is wrong, but I'm suggesting that for many of our majority world brothers and sisters, they can't make sense of the argument. Now, they're not going to acknowledge this, because if you say, well, this fundamental theological issue doesn't make sense to us, then you're just digging your own grave, which is, again, where we must not be listening to African people, majority world people, speaking to us in our own language. We need to have people on the ground who listen to them in their language as they're engaging their context, and then those Western people on the ground who do that listening still have the foundation back in the West. That means that when they're communicating to people in the West, they're building on the familiar and not on the unfamiliar, or at least still somewhat familiar. Those of us who've been in Africa for a long time struggle more and more to relate to the West, but nevertheless, I can't deny I'm basically a British person whose mind has been messed up. So I'm equipped to communicate with Westerners in a way that African colleagues born and raised in African culture are not. And the identity of gods in the West are beings that are supernatural. Gods in Africa, my ongoing research kind of tells me, one way of understanding gods is really they are emotions. Gods are emotions. But we can't acknowledge that. I don't see it acknowledged in the West at all. Because then we can no longer consider African people as practicing superstitious nonsense, believing in the supernatural. So we stick to this notion, Africans believe in supernatural demons and spirits and gods. I don't think they do. Even the concept of supernatural is not one that can be found in Africa. And then the final example is how to live without ancestral taboos. To us, makes no sense. Of course, you just believe in God rather than the ancestors. But I don't want to try and unravel that now, but it's almost impossible for, it seems to me, African people to separate themselves out from the ancestral commands while living in their own communities. So, orthodoxy of language. Orthodoxy 2 arises from the account of contexts, in particular contexts, when studying the Bible. And I'm saying that Bible translators are uniquely positioned. We ought to acknowledge this. Because they're not guided by traditions that they've not experienced, they will not get Orthodoxy 1. We can continue to do what's happening now and open theological colleges all over the continent whose curricula is rooted in the West, US or Germany or UK, and people learn to regurgitate that, if you use a negative term, and the next generation, the same will have to happen. And of course, once people go into ministry, then they no longer really draw on that because they know they're working with people in Orthodoxy too. So to me, the notion that we should teach theologically is correct, but the Westerner needs to be teaching in an indigenous African language so they begin to engage what's actually happening, and that language has to be learned contextually. You can't learn it from a book or in a classroom. So the position now of a theological educator needs to be that Westerners who, if you use this terminology, has first immerse themselves indigenously, using indigenous tongue, without using foreign money to buy them a following in order to grasp how to practice theological education that does local roots. Alignment. As already said, I think we have to say we need to recognize Orthodoxy 2, indigenous orthodoxies, in order to go about aligning them with traditional orthodoxies. And I think that should be our goal, to maintain the unity of the Christian faith by seeking to come together. There's a major task. Yes, we have people who acknowledge the Trinity, for example, because not to do so would be economic suicide. But to get to the place where the examples I've given kind of stand up and indigenous people can make their own sense in the way that we do is a long distance away, and we're not even trying to broach that gap. So we shouldn't assume Orthodoxy 1, and neither should African people be allowed to assume that they're practicing Orthodoxy 1. If we want reports from indigenous African people, or indigenous people from other parts of the world, we seem to forget, particularly as English spreads more widely, they are already using English for attaching their own meanings. And they're not wrong to themselves. But there's no clear basis for open communication between us and them anymore, because the translation step has been obliterated. In other words, if you go from Britain to, what should I say, to Zimbabwe, and you use the Shona language, you have this process of translation. When a Shona speaks to us in English, what's happened to that process? It's gone, but its impact is absent. So when we hear them speak English, we assume they're the same as us. No, they're not. They're using that English to translate their own terms. So this self-deception we impose upon ourselves by seeing ourselves as taking non-Western people seriously when they speak to us in our languages kind of needs to go. Maybe we need to remove the subsidy on Orthodoxy 1. Now, in a sense, if you subsidize Orthodoxy 1, say financially, of course that promotes it, and well, that's a good thing, because I will go along with saying that Orthodoxy 1 is the correct orthodoxy. On the other hand, of course, when you subsidize your own orthodoxy, you're actually judging someone else as being unorthodox, which seems to run a little bit contrary to Matthew chapter 7, beginning of the chapter. And when you conceal by means of subsidizing Orthodoxy 1 what's happening in Orthodoxy 2, you're not enabling any alignment or rectification. So, to look then at the future of theology, artificial intelligence, and the world. There are deep differences between Orthodoxy 1 and Orthodoxy 2. Now, an example that's often prominent, prosperity gospel. And it seems to me that people in the West just can't work this out. Why do people in Africa are they so addicted to prosperity gospel? And of course, they blame themselves. They say, well, this is what the Americans taught them, which is another, I mean, not exactly a trick, but taking responsibility for other people's beliefs as if we were the ones who misled them is a rather unhelpful way of taking responsibility for ourselves as if we know the answer, when frankly the answer just isn't so easy to find. So prosperity gospel is a prime example of where we do perceive problems in majority world theologies, and solutions and comprehensions are hard to come by. The Western world is built on what it has, and in contemporary times the official understanding is that Christianity has been irrelevant to that, and whether there had been any belief in Christ or not, we will be just the same as we are. Now that lie is supported by an inclusion of Orthodoxy too. If you convince Western people that Africans love as they love, and Africans value as they value, and Africans believe as they believe, and Africans do as they do, then there's no need to credit Christ for what he's done in our lives, or those of our forefathers, that has made us what we are today. Now, as I say, I think as Westerners, we must acknowledge that we have things to teach people. Otherwise, we're hypocritical, because we're drawing on things that we're denying other people. We must have things to teach people. We must see ourselves as having a system that is better, and so can they. I mean, that's also allowed. But to deny that is hypocrisy. Should the secular world, because the secular world has really got us into this situation, be forced into a position of having to recognize cultural difference, then also the role of theology in bringing cultural change, then theology goes back to be the queen of the sciences. And we're just like a hair's breadth away from that, but yet we're also a long distance from it. Bible translators can help to bring us nearer. What will AI be like in the future? Well, in order to acknowledge Orthodoxy too, two things, just simple suggestions. Number one, before you start talking with ChatGPT 5, 6, 7, whatever it is, ChatGPT will have to know your ethnicity. Now, it may do that by looking at your face, or hear your accent. And then, of course, if it recognizes your Orthodoxy 1, and you say, look, I've got a fever, it will tell you to use Panadol, or whatever, medical treatment. If it recognizes your Orthodoxy 2, and you have a fever, it'll say, slaughter a goat. If you want to get healing, find a goat, kill it. I think it'd be hard to get that from AI at the moment, because AI only tells what are orthodox answers, Orthodoxy 1, which is going to confuse people in the majority world, and is already confusing the West, and will confuse AI, because they won't have a clue how to deal with people who think that the solution for high temperature is killing a goat. Now, the question of Islam also here rises, and maybe Islam is Orthodoxy 2.5, because of course the Muslims rejected the scriptures and built their orthodoxy on not scriptures. But nevertheless, what I see happening a great deal is that the West learns about Islam from Muslims who speak to them in English. And that just is a vast epistemological error. We need to learn about Muslims from how they engage in their own languages, in their own contexts, including in Arabic, in Middle Eastern contexts. Before that, I'm not sure we really have much knowledge at all. Another thing I think will happen in tomorrow's world is that intercultural use of one language may be declared illegal. So to teach, say, a Zulu person in Southern Africa English would be illegal because it's so destructive. Because what the Zulu person would do is attach their own cultural context to the terms that we teach them, which will confuse the Zulu person and confuse us if we think that we understand what they're saying to us. So I think Bible translation has a key role. We must inform large language models of AI that what's currently being thought is a result of taboos. AI doesn't see the taboos. We do, if we think carefully enough. We have to think carefully and inform AI of the taboos that we're using as we're making our sense. And thus perhaps avert the potential for AI bringing massive disaster and head a little bit more towards a little utopia. Thank you very much indeed. That's what I have at this point.